We've been doing this podcast for 2.5 years now, and the most listened to episodes are always the ones talking about career and certifications in Treasury. So we decided to partner up with the AFP, the Association for Financial Professionals, so we can offer you a $100 discount code on all of the AFP's products. This includes, of course, the CTP, the Certified Treasury Professional, which is hands down the most renowned and recognized certification in Treasury out there. And of course, the access to the CTP exam prep platform as well. Check the link in the description to access to those discount codes and take your career to the next level.
In terms of drawbacks, from a treasury perspective, probably the biggest would be...
What would you say are the biggest advantages of having a regional treasury front office in Europe?
Why Europe? Is it the time zone?
Easiest explanation would be a time zone. We actually are able to cover whole world, still working European hours.
The difference between front office and back office.
Front office team would be the team actually facing the bank, asking for the rates, negotiating and doing transactions. And then all the back office comes in and they would do confirmation of trades and of course the payment.
The unique challenges in coordinating between the front office and back office.
Potential challenge that could happen between front office and back office would be when those teams
So Kasia, it's great to have you here to talk about Treasury regionalization, but it'd be really nice if you could just kick off for our listeners with a little bit of an explanation of what that actually means in the context of your role at Colgate-Palmolive.
So Colgate is organized into 4 regional treasury centers. The first one in US is actually located in our headquarters in New York. Then we have a European Treasury Center that I'm part of, and it's located in Warsaw in Poland. And then we have as well a center in Asia Pacific in Latin America. So those are kind of 4 regional centers, but all those centers follow a corporate strategy and a global treasury policy. So I think it's for us more like a hybrid, having regional centers, but kind of aligned on a corporate strategy. All those centers are actually quite standardized. So we are standardized in terms of tasks, in terms of systems. We work very closely together. Actually, just 2 weeks ago, I was attending a global treasury meeting in New York where all representatives from all centers met. And we talked about our projects, about experiences. We talked about the future of the department too. So we are working very, very closely together. And I think it kind of makes the structure quite efficient. Colgate operates in almost 200 countries. So I think running the treasury center from one location would be actually almost impossible.
It's a very tough job, yeah.
Exactly. And maybe worth mentioning that when I started working for Colgate in 2010, we only had 2 centers, one in US and one in Europe. And then only in the following years, we realized we want to expand our treasury coverage. And this is where the corporate treasury made the decision to create a center in APAC and LATAM, which are now fully operational.
Awesome stuff. It sounds like you've got an awful lot going on, but like you say, it makes complete sense to have that regionalized structure when you've got 200 countries to cover and there's a lot of local nuances. But for anyone in the audience who isn't operating on a regionalized basis, can you maybe share a little bit more about some of the benefits that you've observed with regionalizing, but also on the flip side of that, maybe some of the drawbacks or challenges with that approach rather than the globalized approach?
Yes, of course. I would say the biggest benefit is actually being very close to the local teams. We want Treasury team to be perceived as a kind of an advisor, as a partner, working very closely with the local finance teams. So being in this regional centers allows us to work with on the regional basis and even on the kind of a country basis. And this is in terms of understanding their cash liquidity, understanding their bank account structure, looking into their P&L and balance sheets in order to come up with some kind of efficient hedging strategy. So this kind of allows us to kind of work with them very closely. I would say as well on some tasks which are non-standard, let's say dividend planning, loan restructuring, some, let's say, M&As. We as well want to apply our expertise in terms of like tax implications, legal regulations. I mean, sometimes even speaking their local language helps. So this is which I see a huge advantage. Maybe another one as well, working quite closely with the local banks. And of course, Colgate works with global banks, but then those banks would have their local branches. And we really, really value this kind of cooperation that we have on the country or regional level. In terms of drawbacks, I could imagine that from a treasury perspective, probably the biggest would be lack of cash visibility, having this kind of regional centers. However, in Colgate, again, I think this is where we kind of don't really have this issue because having regional centers allows us to see the cash on a regional basis and then immediately report it to corporate. And maybe a good example is the IPAC center that was created some years ago. Before we had a center in Asia Pacific, the cash was actually managed on the country basis. Of course, still reporting to corporate treasury. But when we introduced APAC Treasury Center, they actually even managed to cash pool whenever possible the cash. And this, again, gives us a better visibility. And maybe another disadvantage that could happen with the regional centers could be the kind of lack of central direction, lack of standardization. But again, I think we managed to kind of eliminate it because we have this kind of, I would say, hybrid structure.
Wonderful stuff, Kasia. Thank you for that.
So when you say you have this hybrid structure, which treasury tasks are centralized versus regionalized, and why, would you say?
So yes, we have a couple functions which are centralized in New York, in our headquarters. So this would be like enterprise risk management, insurance, I would say working closely with the global relations, let's say corporate finance. Those functions relate to the company as a whole. So I would say it really makes sense to have them in New York. We do have one exception, which is the Global FX Center, which is actually located in Europe. It's actually my team doing this role. And we actually execute all FX transactions for all Colgate subs. So we execute transactions, I would say, on a global basis. One comment here is that the Global Treasury Center is about the execution, is about the actual trading. We still would have people in those local centers, these kind of regional centers, that would be working with our subs. So maybe again, let's give you an example. So our colleagues in APAC would work very closely with, let's say, Thailand team to understand their needs, understand that their future cash flows, understand, let's say, what currency they need to buy, what currency they need to sell. And then once they have this information, they would come to us and they would put a trade request for a spot, forward, swap, and then my team would be actually the one executing the FX trades.
And why do you think it's important for FX to be centralized? Why is that something that the local teams can take care of? I mean, why is someone in Europe managing Thai baht transactions on the other side of the world?
I think probably the biggest advantage would be the efficiency. So we have one team, we have one access to one platform. We can actually coordinate it between ourselves. We are actually executing the trades for all Colgate world. So I think this is actually what makes our job like extremely exciting. So in the morning, we actually cover Asia trades. So we kind of get up about 8 o'clock. We do trades for Australia, Thailand, Philippines, all those really exotic countries. Then we as well provide trades for European subsidiaries. And then, of course, in the afternoon when US wakes up, we work with our colleagues from US, Canada, Mexico, and so on. We as well, for the majority of our trades, we trade them as so-called back-to-back trades. So it means that our regional European subsidiary is actually the one facing the bank. And then we only have a back-to-back trade internally. So in terms of your question, why do you think it's easier to have it in one place? I would say all this kind of legal work, let's say all this KYC, all those mandates, I think it makes so much easier to have in majority kind of one subsidiary. And then maybe just to add, of course, if we have those kind of big trades, then I imagine we have some kind of like a purchasing power when kind of negotiating rates with banks. But for sure, as well, working with all those kind of different markets allows us to build up a great relationship with banks, which is very critical for us.
So that's an interesting point, actually. So do you have a European primary banking partner which is able to execute these currency trades globally? Or are you working with local banks or regional banks from Europe? How's your banking infrastructure or your FX partner, whoever that is? How are you working with them?
Yes, so we actually have two models. I would say for the less regulated countries, which I would say probably are 80% of our trades, we would be using this back-to-back model. And for those, we actually use our European banking partners. I would say European, some of them, of course, are branches of the kind of global banks, right? So kind of, I would say the worldwide top-class banks. But then, because of some countries are so regulated, and here maybe we can talk about South Africa, Colombia, China, we cannot have this back-to-back. So actually, me and my team, we have to be kind of officially the traders for those countries. So let's say when I'm trading for Philippines, I'm actually trading in the name of Colgate-Palmolive Philippines. And the same would be, let's say, for Colombia or so on. So then we actually trade with the local banks. So I would say we are trading whatever is needed with whichever banking partner is needed. But of course, our banking partners are always chosen very carefully. They have to be approved by our corporate strategy. So those are usually, I would say, the global banks, but sometimes as well, their local branches.
And I assume you also develop a lot of natural hedges, right? Which you can oversee, knowing that on one region you're doing, or one part of, for example, in Europe, right? You're doing a Euro-US trade, somewhere else you're doing a US-Euro trade, and those synergies are probably evident to you, which they wouldn't be if it was country to country, right?
Absolutely. We do try. However, it's actually quite tricky to do it kind of like with the netting. Whenever we have natural hedges, then of course we always take advantage. In terms of trading, it's usually a bit more tricky because we need to always protect the functional currency of the subsidiary, right? So this is always where it kind of becomes more difficult to offset. But yes, we actually trade, I would say, probably on 30 different currency pairs. So it's quite interesting, and we try to look where we can have the offsets.
Do you often hedge? Do you have hedges set up with your cash flow forecasting models from all the different regions as well? Because one topic that comes up a lot, Kasia, is treasurers struggle to articulate effectively to the CFO the value add they're bringing to the organization, right? The savings they're bringing, the strategic insight that they're bringing, and the benefit to the business, right? It's usually seen as an admin function, as like a transactional service that needs to be there as opposed to a strategic partner, whereas there's a shift towards that. So one of the key roadblocks to that is effectively demonstrating your value. So are you reporting on the savings you've drawn out to the company from executing these global FX transactions at all? And if so, what KPI is the most eye-opening for the CFO in your case?
So I think when I was talking previously, we always try to be a strategic partner to the local teams. I think it's actually hard to talk about KPIs from Treasury because when we talk to the teams, we actually work with them on, let's say, on their particular subsidiary. But of course, yes, we do keep KPIs in terms of we kind of compare what we hedge versus to what would actually happen in the company. So this is where we kind of keep track. We certainly have hedging policies for most of our subsidiaries. We have different types of strategy. Again, probably more kind of confidential information, but whatever works best for the subsidiary. So I don't think any of our subsidiaries will be exposed to FX risk. And then, yes, I guess that the KPIs would be, I would say, on a sub side, of course, they would know how it's kind of coming up. I would say the hedge versus the actual cash flows.
So, Kasia, I'd like to just do a little bit more of a deep dive into the front office versus back office dynamics, because you've got this regional treasury set up And you've mentioned there that you've got the front office in Europe, but you've obviously got a global scope and you've got other operations centralized in the US. So why Europe? What's the advantage of having that front office in Europe specifically?
Sure, that's a great question. So as I mentioned previously, some time ago, we only had 2 centers. So we had one in US and in Europe. So I would say probably the easiest explanation would be a time zone. We actually are able to cover whole world still working European hours. So we actually wake up, let's say around 8 o'clock, which is not like particularly early for Europe. And then we can still trade within the Asia Pacific markets because the market would usually close, let's say around our 9 or 10 o'clock. So this gives us full flexibility to trade Asia. Then we have time to do Europe, and then we can move on and easily we can trade for US, Canada, and LATAM. So I think this is where Europe is kind of in this perfect place. I guess if this would need to be done from New York, then I guess that they would need to kind of wake up extremely early. So I think Europe has this kind of advantage to be like in the middle of the time zones, which really helps.
Yeah, some very antisocial hours otherwise for everyone. But like you say, get in the office at 8ish and then you can cover Asia off and then get to everywhere else a little bit later on in the day. But Kasia, I just wanted to ask a little bit more around the breakdown of the difference between front office and back office, but specifically in a regional setup. So are there any nuances that would be different between the front and back that very different from a global setup, or is it a similar kind of division of labor? Are there anything that our listeners who don't have a regional setup or who are thinking about going towards a regional setup would want to know around how they split those responsibilities?
Sure. So I guess in Colgate, the split between front office and back office is actually very, very obvious. This is actually regulated by the SOX and audit guidelines. And I think it's particularly visible in our European Treasury Center because we have the front office team that is executing, and then we have the back office team that kind of comes in when the transaction is done. So front office team will be the team that's actually facing the bank. This will be the team asking for the rate, negotiating and doing transaction. And then only back office comes in and they would do the kind of confirmation of trades and of course the payment to the bank. So our back office, of course, is I would say again, the biggest back office because the majority of the trades that are done with banks are actually done between the European subsidiary and the bank. So they would be kind of sending the payment and so on. I would say the regional front office and back office, they have quite similar splits, quite clear splits, let's say in terms of transactions, system access. But of course, the regional front office do not actually trade. They do not ask the bank. They do not close the transaction. So I would say that the split is slightly different.
That makes sense. Okay. And Kasia, just to build on that, tell us a little bit more about the unique challenges in coordinating between the front office and back office within a regional treasury function. Is there ever anything to know that makes it a little bit more difficult being not of a part of a global function, but just being your local regional treasury team? Is there any hurdles that you've come across that you could maybe share with the audience?
Okay, so actually the potential challenge that could happen between front office and back office would be when those teams kind of do not work as one team. Because to be honest, I think we should not even say about 2 teams. I think we should actually talk about sub-teams. Front office is the team that is kind of executing transactions with the bank, but then back office has to confirm the trade and issue the payment. So it's actually very obvious that there is basically no transaction that can happen only with front office or only with back office. Those teams completely kind of complement each other. So I think here that the biggest challenge is to understand that it is one team. They need to be working extremely efficiently together. And this is actually what in Colgate, we've been working on for a long time. I think now it's working very, very efficiently, but I would say probably the biggest challenge. I think it's probably quite similar in the regional centers, not only the global one. Again, let's say back office prepares some reports that then front office is using, right? So this is kind of like the constant cooperation. let's say one team thinks that, they are separate because they're front office or back office, then I don't think it's going to work. So I would say that the cooperation and communication, working together.
Super stuff.
How do you keep the communication alive in that kind of setup, Kasia? So, is it just everyone's on Teams and Teams is firing like mad all day? Or do you have a specific cycle of meetings, like daily catch-ups or something like this to set up? How do your regional and central teams across the world make sure that they're communicating effectively in all this?
But are you now talking about back office and front office, or just the team worldwide?
Well, both, right? So front office and back, but also in a global setting as well, right? So, you said you sit with back office in Europe also, but then you also, I assume, have global regionalized functions also. So how do you keep the communication going in each scenario?
Sure. So let's say between front office and back office, we actually sit together in the office. Of course, now after COVID, it changed slightly. We are actually only two days per week in the office. But yes, certainly we want to make sure that the communication is happening on a regular basis. I would say actually the communication between front office and back office is one of the things that makes the cooperation, so that the challenge that we just spoke previously, this is what it makes it more efficient. It's actually very important that one team understands what the other team is doing. So I would say sometimes we even organized training sessions. So for example, front office was doing some kind of a job, and then back office was just sitting with us in a room and watching what we do, why we do it, how we do it. And the same with back office. I think it's very, very important, because then, let's say if we ask back office for certain report, first of all, we know how long it takes for them to prepare it. And then secondly, they know why we need it with such details, right? So this is kind of, again, critical. So I would say with back office, we have this communication, I would say, ongoing, regular basis. Between the regions, it as well depends. So let's say, for example, because we actually trade the FX for worldwide. So I would say probably every day I'm communicating with Asia, I'm communicating with US team. We kind of need to know what's happening. And this is either to clarify their request or just maybe to advise something that we just see something that, could be done better. On this kind of a global level, we have monthly meetings. So kind of when kind of the treasury gets together, we as well have quarterly, what we call snack and learn. So we kind of organize some topics to discuss. We have people internally or externally explaining some new ideas. It is as well a good time for some kind of internal recognitions. It's as well a good time to kind of meet new team members. So we kind of want to be together. As well, as I mentioned, we had this 2 weeks ago, we had this global meeting where all kind of 4 centers met together. Where it was actually 3 days of long discussions. And as well, our treasurer, she comes to all those other 3 centers on a quite regular basis. She kind of wants to know what the team is working on. She wants to give some corporate updates. So I think we have a quite good cooperation on the worldwide and the regional level.
Super cool. And so if a treasury organization was about to go through a restructuring to regionalize their operations, what do you think are the best practices that people need to put into place to make sure that that works, right? So imagine you go from a transition, or because you went through this, right? You were there with Colgate before this transition happened. Tell us about that transition, what went well and what maybe you could have done better that you would, from experience, share with the audience that needs to be done in order to ensure you get the most out of the transition.
So I think with such a transition, I think the most important thing is to think about people. I guess finding a good place is about finding good talents, right? So I would say it's not always the cheapest location, but I would say it should be the location where there are, let's say, good universities or some already, let's say, existing center of excellence, like shared services, where we can find people. Because I guess if we move to a location where we cannot hire people, then of course it's not going to work. And here I kind of wanted to stress that Treasury is actually very specific. Treasury requires this kind of very specific thinking. I would say a combination of knowledge with analytical skills and I would say more forward-looking perspective. So I guess it's quite difficult to always find a good Treasury team. And secondly, I think we all know that the Treasury decisions could cost a lot of money, right? So let's say for Colgate, let's say manage a couple $billion. Let's say if we don't have this good talent, if we don't manage to hire good people, then we put our cash at risk. So I think with such transition, it has to be extremely well planned. I would say another thing that I suggest looking into maybe to leverage or let's say take advantage of already existing shared services. So for example, this is what Colgate did. We already had a center of excellence in Warsaw. And this is when in 2010, we made the decision to move the Treasury from Geneva to Warsaw, where we already had a center there. We have discussions about potential people moves. So it's great. And I suggest to kind of leverage such centers. I think it's something that could certainly help with hiring people, good talents.
Definitely. Some great advice there, Kasia. I think what you said about not necessarily going to the cheapest place, looking for those universities and looking at the shared service centre structure, some excellent nuggets there for our listeners. So thank you for that. And speaking of nuggets and sharing wisdom, we're recording this. We're just in the week of Eurofinance. We're both flying out to Copenhagen tomorrow. So obviously this podcast will come out after the event, but it would be great if you could share a little bit with the listeners what you're going to be speaking about and maybe some of the key takeaways from the session that you'll be running.
Yes, so my session will be actually on the second day, on Thursday. I will be part of the Stream 6. And I will be as well focusing on what we just were discussing today. It will be as well the kind of centralized versus the regional structure. I will be in a panel with two other ladies, so we will be sharing different perspectives, what companies went through, what companies think, what is the best. So yeah, let's see whether Colgate model proves to be the best or whether there will be any other advices that I could take. But certainly I will try to share my advices and have a good discussion.
Oh, good stuff. Well, good luck with the session, and I will definitely come and listen, and then maybe we can give the listeners a little bit of feedback from that session when we pop the podcast out. I'll send a few notes around as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show, Kasia. Really excited to have you on. It was really interesting.
Perfect. Thanks so much for inviting me.